what steps should be taken over the course of the next Parliament to alleviate the cost of living crisis?
Finally, a question about something real.
Wow, an economics question. Good God. Can't we talk about
Crazy.
Rwanda again for the millionth time?
So, Joseph, I'm going to come to you first. What steps to alleviate the cost of living crisis?
A great question. And the way to begin answering is think a little bit about the source of that inflation. It goes back to the pandemic, the supply side interruption, and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the rise of food prices, oil, energy prices. And there's an element of what is sometimes called greedflation, that there were many firms who took advantage of the supply side interruptions and the limitation of competition that was associated with that to raise their prices. Markups went way up all over the world. It's important to understand that prices are not going to go down. The rate of inflation has already gone down, not because of the central banks. Let's make sure that we learn that lesson.
Based.
Central banks are celebrating a
True.
victory, but it's not because of them. It was because
Honestly, central banks have become almost like shaman. They like to shake magic sticks at things, and then if things go well, they go, "Yay, we did it! We stopped the rains from coming," or whatever. And if they don't, they just go, "Well, forces out of our control, mate. Nothing we can do about that."
One of the things, it's worth pushing back in also because I think there were plenty of people who seem to take the singular opinion, which is the monetarist opinion, that the only source of inflation can be too much money in circulation, too big a money supply. And that's what he's pushing back against here, this idea that central banks increasing the money supply over the pandemic can be the only source of the inflation, when it's not. It's the supply side shocks that he mentioned in the first half of his answer. So whilst you also shouldn't give central banks plaudits for the reductions in inflation, you're just waiting for the cost push inflation to finish going through the economy, you can also say, well, it's not their fault that the inflation happened in the first place either, not necessarily, at least mostly. There was some amount of it, but not like a huge amount. But of course, unfortunately, is that the bad thing the Bank of England has done, as Set the Shallow points out in chat, is that they have kept interest rates high unnecessarily when the month-on-month inflation rate is basically zero, because they deliberately wanted to stop wage growth because they are fearing a wage price spiral that isn't actually happening. And what this has done is meant that the one thing that can actually stop the cost of living crisis, which is wage increases. Obviously, if prices stay stagnant and wages increase, everyone's cost of living gets much easier. But they want that to stop happening because they believe that a wage price spiral, which there's no evidence of for, might actually happen when it's not, which is really silly.
Yeah. Also, look at the moustache in the guy in the second row. Absolutely delightful work.
That's a Chad moment, that is.
Lovely work. Love it.
the market responded to the interruptions, the demand shifts, the supply shortages, and they have over time become alleviated, not totally eliminated, and prices have, the rate of inflation has come down. Prices are not going to go back to where they were.
Well, look, we've got representatives of three parties here. We've got the Conservatives, Labour and the SNP. And I know you're familiar with the situation politically here. What is your view about what the steps they're suggesting to alleviate the cost of living crisis?
Well, I think they made two big mistakes during the period that we up to now. They allowed the increase of gas prices and oil prices to get passed through to consumers through the regulatory system.
This is the government you're talking about.
The government. They shouldn't have allowed that to happen, and it didn't happen everywhere. Some countries managed to disconnect the two, and that's been a big source of a problem. The second thing is, I mentioned before, greedflation, increase in markups. They should have imposed a windfall profits tax and used the revenues from that windfall profits tax to help the people who are really suffering from this cost inflation. The next question, which is the one that was actually asked, is what should government do now?
Well, see, all I'm thinking is, since we've got the parties here and they can respond to you, I mean, Labour's
Also,
got all sorts
again,
of suggestions to what they should do. What do you
what's also important is talking about, you know, the money, new money from fiscal expansion that's necessary to invest in creating the new jobs that can, you know, give us all wage growth at the end of the day by having good, high-paid, high-skilled, unionised jobs, for example. because that's what's necessary. Whereas we're actually having austerity and it's pushing our economy back completely unnecessarily. I noticed that Kenneth Rogoff of the Reinhard Rogoff paper fame was in the Guardian today defending the idea that debt financing or monetary financing of government spending is not going to be the way out of this current economic malaise. And I'm just like, you're still going after your debunked paper from 2010, are you? How embarrassing.
What do you think of their proposals?
I think they're moving in the right direction. I don't think they've been ambitious enough,
Okay.
but I think they're moving in the right direction.
And the SNP?
I'm not as familiar with their position. I mean, let me make it clear what the issue is. As I said, prices are not going to come down. What we needed to do is get wages up. And there are two things to get wages up: increase the bargaining power of workers, reduce the monopoly power of corporations, and secondly, increase productivity. And what's the best way to increase productivity? Right now in the UK?
Cattle prods. Just electrocute workers who don't work hard enough.
More public investment.
See,
NHS,
everything I've been
people
saying.
talked about
Yep.
healthcare problems. Lack of investment in healthcare is a productivity issue. It's a social issue. It's a health issue. But if you're waiting in line to get treated for an illness of any kind, you're not as productive as you could be if you got treated more quickly. So that's one. But there's a whole range of investments that need to be made. And even if it's hard within the budget,
Should still
they
be done.
should,
Okay, well, listen, let's put some of these points then.
You mentioned the international context, which was very challenging for all governments. You mentioned the war in Ukraine, COVID, obviously, before
See,
that.
he does the politician hand thing as well, where if you put rave music behind it, it looks like he's doing little fish, big fish, cardboard box type hand movement.
Yeah, it's
thing.
either that or it's the thumb press.
Yeah,
It's
the
either-
David Cameron thumb press.
Yeah.
Yes, family, family, family. That thing, yeah.
And I think that made things very, very challenging. Inflation went up globally. Now, we've worked very hard in partnership with the Bank of England. It's not all down to the central banks, but they have a key role to play. Interest rates did go up and have gone up
That's part
because
of the
by
cost of
doing that,
living.
but of course, that affects the cost of living. Now, inflation, we brought inflation down from 11.1% to 3.2%.
You didn't bring it down.
You know,
You didn't do anything. Right, so just to make sure that everybody who's watching this, because I'm going to put this on YouTube later, knows exactly what I'm talking about here. What cost push inflation means is when supply side shocks happen, like Stiglitz mentioned beforehand, input prices into your economy goes up. All of the things that you need to make the commodities that get sold within the economy, the price of those constituent parts goes up, therefore the costs for businesses go up. To maintain their profit levels, therefore they're put up prices. No extra demands to meet that, it just makes living harder. That's what cost push inflation is. Now, the actual prices of those inputs have gone down because the supply side shocks have kind of petered out. But the prices are still high because you can't reduce prices, because deflation where prices comes down means your economy kind of grinds to a halt. So what that means now is you need wages to therefore catch up. But what the Bank of England is doing by increasing interest rates is that it's trying to say that the inflation is being caused by an increase in overall demand, which doesn't exist because people's wages were stagnant. There wasn't there was some extra money, but it wasn't necessarily as much as the difference in price that you were getting from the increase in input costs. So they're saying, oh, well, people just have too much money to buy all the goods and services in the economy, so we therefore have to take the money away by increasing the cost of new money through higher interest rates, which is nonsensical, because no matter how much demand you have in your economy, that's not changing how much it costs to buy grain from the Donbass, how much it costs to import liquefied national gas to be able to heat the buildings that bring the goods to market to sell the commodities that get purchased and sold, which ends up being an overhead that goes into the output price that people actually buy in the shops. So the Bank of England have done the opposite of the right thing here, because they've keep rates too high for no reason under flawed economic analysis.
You didn't do it. The market
guys,
did it.
what I said,
Laugh at again.
Yeah, every
week.
time. Every time.
what I started by saying was we're working in partnership with the Bank of England. It's
Is
not
it-
entirely.
Is it a good sign when on an election day one of your finance ministers is being publicly laughed at.
Every
Is that a
single
good
time.
sign?
Yeah,
Is that a
absolutely.
good sign? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Rishi Sunak's career looking pretty up in the air at this point. It's worth
Yeah.
pointing out as well. It's worth pointing out as well. Sorry, whilst we're still on the economics of this. When Bima Falami says, we worked in partnership with the Bank of England, of course the Bank of England stuff I've debunked there already, but it's worth pointing out the Conservatives think, well, if the Bank of England also thinks that it's because there's too much demand, what that means is we can't create any more demand by giving people more money or by implementing policies that would give people more money to spend. So, for example, when the interest rates went up and people's mortgages were more expensive, there were a lot of calls from people for the government to do some kind of intervention to stop mortgages from being too expensive. And the Conservative government are like, no, we are quote-unquote fiscally principled. We can't intervene with people's mortgages because one of the mechanisms that rising interest rates does to curb demand is making people pay more for money they've borrowed, which is what a mortgage is. So if we give them mortgage relief, they will have more money to spend, demand won't get shrunken, and we won't reduce inflation based upon the same faulty assumption that the Bank of England made. So what they've done is say, well, the Bank of England don't want you to have enough money to live. We also don't want that because that would not stop inflation going down based upon a faulty assumption. So that's what they believe they've done. They believe that their interaction with inflation is we didn't spend any money, we didn't increase the national debt, for example, which they actually have done, but that's another story. Therefore, you must therefore praise us for not making inflation worse, I guess. But again, faulty assumptions because they don't believe that cost-push inflation can be a thing. It can only be a function of the increase in the money supply.
Also, it's very interesting that conservative economics always relies on the poor remaining poor.
Exactly.
Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the situation. Doesn't matter if it's inflation, deflation, greedflation, stagflation. It's always the poor need to remain poor. It's almost like status quo economics. At its fundamental core, hasn't really changed in 205 years.
There was a very short period where that wasn't the case, from 1945 to 1979. Both parties in this country absolutely admitted that the state needed to spend new money on investments with an industrial strategy to boost jobs, boost production, and make sure people were employed, and there was enough for people to be able to survive with a proper welfare state and publicly owned public services. That was a very short period of the entire history of all economic existence of the United Kingdom, where wages were equal. We had one of the most equal economies in Europe at that point, really and truly. Ben Sharp pointed that in my chat before, and that is an aberration in the entire history of humanity. There's never really been a time, apart from like what Marx would have described as primitive communism, where there's been this level of equality under like an economy throughout the Industrial Revolution, through feudalism, all of that, all throughout that period. All humanity knew, outside of kind of more primitive times, primitive communism times, was rampant inequality and unfair social relations. And that short period of high taxation, high redistribution, and an active state between 1945 and 1979 is a tiny blip where we actually could show that we could do things differently. And that's the legacy of Clement Attlee, really and truly, is the legacy of the one period in the entirety of human history where society was actually pretty equal.
Any one actor. No, but look, let me move forward. One of the things.
How many homeowners are there here?
Look, one of the things that makes it harder for inflation to stay down over time is if you increase your debt burden. And
Not true.
We have a plan to make sure.
See, when I literally said, when I was critiquing his position before, was I knew he was going to say, I'm literally going to say, oh, well, what happens is they think that it's because you spend too much money, when there's no evidence that this is demand-driven inflation. I literally preempted everything that he's going to say here, because these people are dialogue tree people. They never studied proper economics, proper macroeconomics at all, ever. They just get received wisdom from their stupid PPE degrees from Oxford and then recite it verbatim as received wisdom. I'm not saying that you can just like print a bunch of money and give it to people. That would be inflationary. We've seen what happens when they did that in America. They just gave people stimulus checks, and it did lead to some demand-driven inflation that kind of went away pretty quickly, as we've seen from the interventions by the central bank there, which you probably could say not the same over here. But what's important is none of us here are calling to just throw free money at people. What we're actually calling for is we're calling for state investment into new productive infrastructure, which is not the same, because that's what Biden is doing right now, running a 7% deficit on green energy projects and renovating a bunch of infrastructure that they have never not done in years, right? And they can do that. Like, spending money on new productive infrastructure is something that you can spend on in a non-inflationary manner, and that's exactly what we're advocating for, because that's going to create the jobs and the good wages to be able to make our economy better. Like, one thing that's really important to understand is that there's one big difference, I think, between kind of liberal economists and social democratic economists, is that lots of social democratic economists will want to hit towards a full employment economy, because that maximizes, as Joseph Stiglitz was pointing out, the bargaining power of workers. If it's employers competing for workers, that pushes wages up and makes the working class the one in the position of power. Conservatives will kneecap the bargaining position of workers. They will try and force people into looking for work like they're doing with the disabled, because that means that the unemployment population rises. Therefore, there are more people competing for the jobs rather than the other way around, which again pushes wages down. Like, being really draconian on benefits it's a supply side labour market reform. It pushes down wages. So that's what Tories are doing, because they don't want full employment. They want bosses to be powerful. That's what Koletsky talked about all of the time. Like, no capitalist will ever want a full employment economy, even though they tend to say that they want. They will say, oh, unemployment is really low and that's a really good thing, and then they'll try and make it go up with these silly benefit reforms that they're doing right now. I would argue personally for a federal jobs guarantee. I think the state should offer anyone who wants a job who has not got one from the private sector any job. Just find a job for them to do and offer it to them. Don't force them, don't do workfare, but they should offer one to maximise the bargaining power of workers against the private sector.
That debt will be falling by the end of the 5-year forecast period.
It's going to be rising up until that point.
I said by the end of the forecast period, it's coming down. And then also, if you talk about the cost of living on ordinary people, making sure that ordinary people can take home more of their own money is critically important. That's why we're cutting national insurance. We cut it by a third, which is a double taxation on work. We've cut that by a third in the last 2 fiscal events, the budget and the autumn statement. Why does that matter? It's not just...
Oh, he's even doing the Trump pinch.
That's about £900.
He's even doing the weird Trump pinching thing as well, where it looks like he's pulling the wings up a fly.
For an average worker, but critically, it increases the labour supply, because what we're actually doing is that means you get more hours, more people into work. That helps grow the economy over the long.
As you know, the tax burden is the highest it's been for 70 years, but I'm sure you're obviously familiar with that.
Jesus Christ. So everything you just said, yeah, you're talking shit, mate. Anyway, moving on to somebody else who's probably going to talk slightly less shit, hopefully.
Peter.
Okay, thank you.
So what about Joseph's points? I mean, let's take advantage of the fact that Joseph is here. And what he's saying is you're not being ambitious enough in Labour.
I'm going to try and answer Russell's point and Professor Stiglitz's in one go. In direct answer to the question, just one example of how we're going to lower the cost of living for individuals is set up a nationally owned company called GB Energy that will power the green revolution.
When are they going to drop that idea as well?
I mean, they're not dropping it because it's a lie. They're not creating a publicly owned company called GB Energy. GB Energy is, or will be, an investment fund. It's a rebadging of the National Investment Bank stuff, but specifically for the green energy thing. For them to give, not subsidy, but investment into public-private partnerships on green energy. What that actually means is getting like a 25% stake in green energy startups is what they're planning on doing. It's not going to sell anybody any energy. It's not going to basically own anything, because they've said they want a 3-to-1 investment ratio, private to public. So they will only have a maximum of 25% equity in any of these green companies. So in terms of what they actually own so much they can affect policy, it's literally going to be nothing. They'll get some returns, which is good. It's investment. It's better than nothing. It's one of the few policies that I've genuinely been supportive of. It's not what I'd choose. I would just choose to have an actual state-owned energy company called GB Energy that owned all of the stuff and also sold it and made all of the proceeds, but, you know, kind of everything in this world. But
we will make sure we have green energy on tap using British technology that will drive down the cost of electricity and the charge to individuals in individual households. That's one measure that will drive down prices for people. Now,
but just come to Joseph's point, is saying you're not being ambitious enough with investment. Obviously, Labour has reined back considerably on how much it was going to invest.
Let me now just point to the fact that you cannot have an individual policy on top of not getting the fundamentals right, because the government is not getting the fundamentals of running an economy right. So you mentioned ambition. Professor Stiglitz mentioned a whole range of other areas. With Labour, on day one, in the first 100 days, we will legislate for a new deal for working people to give the stability for people.
Which you've just absolutely gutted.
Literally,
And will be pointless. Yeah.
literally him coming on the channel saying, haha, they may have nothing, but we have these two policies that we have massively stripped back incredibly recently. I don't think we'll be running on that one, mate.
In the workplace and balance the rights between workers and employers. You know, we will set the target of 1.5 million new homes being built to stimulate growth into the economy.
It's worth pointing out as well is that he says here, oh, we got this target to build 1.5 million homes. I'm like, that's the government's target that exists already. They have 300,000 per year as their existing target. Your ambition is identical to the current government's ambition. Like, that's literally changing absolutely nothing. And second of all, you literally cannot guarantee that you'll make that many homes at all, because your plan is to just go, hope the private sector pulls them out of the ether, with no plan, no state investment in social housing at all being promised whatsoever by the Labour Party at the moment. And they just got like, well, we'll change some planning laws, and then fingers crossed, guys, hope they do it.
On planning legislation, so we can get labs being built, so we can get data centres being built, so that we can get all of the investment into the infrastructure of the future being done. We're going to reform the regulatory system. We're going to create a fast track through regulation so that innovation that comes out of places like Cambridge goes straight into the economy to create wealth and jobs as soon as possible. These are the sorts of things that are going to get the fundamentals of running the economy right, to get growth into the economy. We're going to make sure that is invested into our public services, because you cannot have a functioning economy where people are having money in their pocket if 8 million Britons...
They're going to invest in money in public services. What money? Money invested in public services that's on day-to-day spending, under Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules, has to come from increased taxation. And you say you're not going to do it. You're lying to us, Peter. Either the fiscal rule is a lie, and you will spend money from fiscal expansion on day-to-day spending, or the promise not to tax people is a lie, which would have to be a massive U-turn because they've already promised not to raise taxes, or the investment in public services is a lie. These three things cannot be true at the same time, Peter. And for them to just continually say, oh, the problem with public services, they're not been invested in, where are we going to get the investment money from? I don't know. Like, it's the fact that no journalist quizzes them on this ever is, again, it's just UK journalism, just continual, permanent journalistic malpractice.
Right. Indeed.
Are waiting for treatment on the NHS. All of these things are interconnected. We will get the balance of that right, the fundamentals, and then have those specific policies to make sure we tackle the cost of living crisis.
Woman here in the green dress.
So I feel the government has invested millions during the last few years in things like the PPE scandals. So in a cost of living crisis, how can the government rationalise?
To be fair, they have fiscally invested in rich people enormously. That is true. Michelle Mone has been the greatest recipient of socialism in recent times.
Their failures in wasting public money, and what impact does that have to us as in the general public?
Okay, let me just go around a few more people first, if I may. The woman here in the front in the orange cardi.
I feel very frustrated at the panel not mentioning the B word, because there's no doubt that Brexit has had a profound effect on the economy.
Obsessed. These people are obsessed. Genuinely obsessed. Like, honestly, it is. I saw somebody on Twitter, right, quote a Ben Bradshaw Guardian article about the trauma of Brexit. I'm sorry. You can be upset. I understand why you wanted to stay in. I also wanted to vote for Remain, right? I didn't at the time, but I would have voted for Remain if I'd voted. I understand you being upset.
Oh, you didn't vote? Oh, I thought you were a Ramona.
No, I was in London for the day. I was going to vote Remain, but I decided to go to London to see a friend instead. But
fair enough.
Anyway, like I supported Remain. Like, I get why you're upset, but the trauma of Brexit, come on. That is exactly the kind of thing that somebody who's only ever had to care about politics since Brexit was a thing, it's the exact kind of thing that they would say. And
to answer the question, Russell, and I think it's great that you raised this question. I think it's a really important one. And inflation and the pain that inflation brings, and how asymmetric inflation can be, because people on the very lowest incomes dealing with things like food inflation, it can be absolutely brutal. I feel a little more optimistic than the rest of the panel about
She's
the fact
very
that inflation
smiley.
seems to be moving in the
Is she says, well, I'm very optimistic. Yeah, of course somebody who's rich enough to be part of the Conservative in-group, to be an advisor for them for 3 years. Yeah, of course you're optimistic. You have to deal with the fact that the rest of us can't, are struggling to be able to heat our homes.
interest rate cuts like towards the end of the year that will make a material difference to people's lives. The actual answers around this are that we obviously have to keep inflation under control, but we have to go for growth. And the reality of encouraging business investment in particular, we're seeing quite a lot of business investment in Cambridge, for instance, is that that is the way to drive productivity and really get our economy moving. Now, the government's done some really interesting things around capital expensing, which basically encourages businesses and corporations to spend a lot more money in investing in its people. And that's going to take a while to see through, and it's got to stay consistent. But I think the answers here lie in
Basically,
growth.
right,
And because
what she's
ultimately,
saying,
and Joseph alluded to this,
what she's specifically saying here is, we cut taxes on businesses, and that's why the economy is going to get better. That's her pitch here to the public who can't afford to put their heating on, saying, you'll be fine though because of all of these taxes that we cut on businesses. And I'm like, or you could just spend state money and create new jobs like we've
thankfully-
done for years between 1945 and 1979.
Yeah, but thankfully there is a world-renowned economist, so hopefully we get to hear from the one knowledgeable person on the panel.
the reality is that we live in a global
And
system
he is the
where
Stieglitz of them
global
all.
supply shocks, like a war or like energy prices, supply chain shocks.
How
something
long?
like an
How long are they going to use Ukraine? How many more fucking times do I have to hear the words Ukraine or war? Every other country had to deal with that shit too, and they seem to have bounced back from the economic shock of it pretty well, actually. We haven't. Why is that?
unprecedented pandemic may happen. What we've got to do is have the gears in our
Again,
economy.
every other country had that.
Spain has
Lot-
been doing well with state
lot-
investment for, as somebody pointed out in chat earlier, they've been doing absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Pedro
I
Sanchez is like the
literally-
best leader in Europe at this point.
Yeah, we looked at some of the growth data across Europe on stream during the week. Italy, a country that was broken before the pandemic, it's been broken for a very long time, was outgrowing us.
I mean, people are paid enough to weather that storm.
Joseph, can I come back to you and just ask, A, what you think of what you've heard? And also there are a couple of points made there. You want to...
I think you'd be in a better position to answer this, Helena. Yeah, is Stieglitz a Keynesian? My opinion was that he basically was, but I thought you might have a more complex answer, but that's fine.
Yeah, he's a very classical Keynesian.
In Brexit and the effect on the economy. And you were talking about government wasting money on things like PPE, which hasn't been used, that kind of thing. So what do you think of what you've heard?
So the most important aspect of this is, yes, we need more investment. And part of the issue here and the differences is what kind of investment? One part of the investment, I think everybody should agree on, is investment in the public health system, NHS.
Yeah, I don't think everyone does agree, sadly, because they haven't been doing that. And
Well,
the
ironically,
party aren't
they
really
have-
going to do that.
Ironically, they have spent a lot of money on the NHS. Like, I've mentioned this on stream before, but like, people will try and say, oh, well, the NHS is in a garbage position because of Sunak. That's why we hate the Tories. And I'm like, nah, mate, the current Conservative government has invested the most, not just in nominal terms, but as a percentage of GDP than any government has ever in the history of the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, that was after we reduced NHS spending as a percentage of GDP every year from 2010 to 2018 under Osborne and Cameron. Right? You can hate Rishi Sunak for plenty of reasons. I obviously do. I think he's the worst prime minister we've had since David Cameron. But really, if you on the NHS specifically, the damage was already done under Cameron and Osborne, and what Rishi Sunak is doing is picking up the pieces. And it's really important to understand this, because whilst we should hate Rishi Sunak for plenty of other reasons, what we can't do is let Osborne and Cameron off the hook by letting some fool guy take the blame who's picked up a broken vase already. No. George Osborne and David Cameron took the NHS vase and smashed it up like the printer on Office Space, and have gotten off scot-free to gallivant around to bloody NATO conferences or be doing shitty centrist podcasts with Ed Balls, and haven't had any of the comeuppance for the democidal policy they inflicted on this country. And I'm not going to let Rishi Sunak, even though I hate him, take the fall for their failures.
Yes, it is really a jewel that UK has. I wish we had.
True.
electricity, renewable electricity, can bring the prices down if it's done in the right way. And I think what Peter says is right, that something along those lines is the kind of investment. More broadly, though,
Again, notice something along those lines. Something. So it's doing very much the thing of this is exactly the sort of thing we should be doing, which means don't do that thing, do a better thing than that. Is basically what he's saying. Which, you know, he has to be diplomatic. You know, he deals with politicians all the time. You know.
you are in a global landscape, you're in a global competition, and right now you're losing. Cambridge is a real source of innovation, but it needs more support. And if you ask, you know, what is the strength of the United States? Is it the private sector? No, the real strength of and I mean, it's partly the private sector, but what has created the big tech giants that are so good at tax avoidance is that our technology, our great universities, none of which are for profit, they're all private, are endowments or foundations or state universities like University of California, Berkeley. And that's why the kind of innovation policies that Peter represents, but they're not ambitious enough, are the way to go.
Okay.
True.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Honestly, yeah. Like, I want to buy him a beer.
Isn't it crazy how literally everything that I've been saying on stream, hammering into my audience for the last 2 years, turns out I was right all along? Because Joseph Stiglitz agrees with me. What's important as well, when he talked about the universities being a hub of innovation, Mariana Mazzucato talks about this a lot in the entrepreneurial state, about the idea that, well, actually, you know, a lot of these kind of public investments, what created the innovation that the private sector made profitable and you be able to unleash towards to get products to market. This is why when the Conservative government talk about, well, we need to get rid of loads of student visas, which is their plan if they do this 100-day policy blitz, is essentially kneecapping one of our best export markets, which is our universities. If people are coming, bringing foreign capital to study in our universities, we are essentially exporting a good to them by getting their foreign capital spent on it, which is really good for our economy and also creates all of the graduates that we need to innovate if we have the public investment alongside. And now they're not doing the public investment and they want all of the foreign students to fuck off. It's why do they hate our economy so much? It's crazy.
True. Also, it's good that that Stiglitz is a regular viewer of yours, and he's clearly, let's be honest, he's clearly plagiarized.
True.
I'm just saying. Look at your own ideas.
Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.